All right, welcome all, and thank you for joining us as we unpack the findings from our 2024 U.S. pre-election survey, a survey of prospective international students ahead of the 2024 presidential election. My name is Ellie Butler, and I am Director of Marketing for the USA. I'm joining you live today from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I know we have folks joining us from all across the US, as well as some from north of the border. So welcome to our Canadian friends joining us today as well. We're excited to be presenting the results of our pre-election survey, where we asked prospective students about their reasons for considering the US, their preferences for presidential candidates, their attitudes toward policies that affect their studies, and more. So we have some great data to share with you all today. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording and the slide deck will be shared with you in a follow-up email. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A tool that's located at the bottom of your webinar window, and we'll cover those questions at the end of the session. I am thrilled to be joined today by two of my brilliant colleagues who will be co-presenting the results with me. Sarah Mackey is Senior Partnerships Director for Strategic Initiatives, and Somil Mehta is Senior Client Success Manager. And for those of you attending the session today who may not be familiar with IDP, I will just do a quick introduction. So IDP is a global leader in international education, matching universities, colleges, and schools with the right students worldwide by providing innovative strategic solutions. So pictured here on this slide is our global footprint, including our physical offices in 35 countries and our vast digital footprint spanning the globe. We offer customized data, consultancy, marketing, and in-country activities designed to address your institution's specific needs. And we also collaborate with governments and educational bodies. We provide them with real-time student demand data, and we leverage our expertise in international education to drive impactful policies. So now that you all know IDP, we can dive into the survey discussion. So we'll start with some quick background information that sets the scene for this latest research. So IDP conducted its first election-related survey in January 2021, immediately following the 2020 election. Prospective international students were asked about their perceptions and attitudes toward the US following Biden's victory. And from that survey, it was quite clear that there was a strong preference for Biden over Trump among the majority of international students. As we can see in the headline here, 76% of students said their perception of the US had improved following Biden's victory, while 67% said they were now more likely to study in the US. So now here we are in 2024, we're facing another monumental election, and we wanted to see if student perceptions were the same or if they had shifted since that last survey. So we've decided to conduct both a pre-election and a post-election survey so that we'll have the ability to compare results back to 2021 and see how students feel also once we know the final election outcome. So at this time, I will pass it over to Somil, who will go through our methodology for the survey. Somil, I think you might still be muted. And there we go.
Thanks, Ellie. So as Ellie mentioned, we'll first take a look at the methodology, the survey as context for the results. So this was a 10-minute online survey that was executed, managed, and distributed by IDP. It was out in the field between August 27th and September 12th, and went out to IDP prospective students who had inquired about or applied to US institutions. It was a pulse survey, so we aimed to get about 800 to 1,000 respondents. We ended up with 916 responses. By gender, as you can see, about 52% male and 47% female. In terms of study status, about 57 students had not yet applied, 26% had started the application process, and 17% had already submitted an application to the US. And as we break it down to study level, we see about 40% of students applying to grad school, about 30% to undergrad programs, with smaller percentages to pathway and vocational programs. Here you can see the top sources, countries of respondents, including India, China, Nepal, Kenya, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. So before we dive into the specifics on the election, We wanted to get a sense of why students are choosing the US as a study destination and what other countries they might also be considering. We asked students here, apart from the US, which countries are you considering to study in? As you can see, about a fifth of the respondents are only considering the US as their study destination, which you can see in the call out box here, while the majority are considering a few other destinations. This indicates that a significant number of students are still undecided and weighing various factors before making their final decision. We also can see a continued rise of new destinations outside the Big Four, such as Germany, France, and Singapore. Now, when we look at the same questions by source country, we can see some interesting insights here. India and Nepal have the largest proportion of students who are only applying to the US. The majority of respondents from Kenya are also applying to Canada, and many to the UK and Australia as well. And the majority of Chinese students are also applying to Chinese universities. It is worth noting that none of the respondents from China reported that they are exclusively looking to the US as their destination of choice. Next, we asked students how they perceive the US as a study destination on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being very unfavorable and 10 being very favorable. Anyone who chose 7 or higher was considered a high rating. So here we can see 97% of students from Pakistan ranked the US highly, followed by Kenya, Nepal, India, and then finally China. So clearly, the vast majority of these students view the US very favorably. We then asked students to rank the factors that contribute to their current perception of the US as a study destination. What we saw is a clear consensus for the number one factor, which we can see on the left here. So all source countries ranked quality of education as the number one factor. Then we start to see some variation for number two. Nepal, Kenya, and Pakistan all ranked availability of scholarships and financial aid, while India, and particularly China, saw this as less important. Reputation of institution ranked number 2 for India, but was less important across the other countries. Respondents were then asked to rate various areas of US education systems on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being not attractive and 5 being very attractive. Percentages on this slide reflect the proportion of those who rated each of these aspects with a score of 5 for very attractive. So 68% of respondents rated quality of education as very attractive. This was then followed by reputation or ranking and availability of cutting edge technology. The least attractive aspects, or those that received the fewest very attractive ratings, were diversity of student population, pathways to permanent residency, and post-graduation work visas. With all the sources of information out there, we wanted to know who had the greatest influence on their decision to choose the US as a destination. The top 3 influencers, as we can see on the left, were parents, career advisors, and friends in another country. If we take that question down further, looking at source countries, we can see that parents were the greatest influence for respondents from India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. While in Kenya, career advisors had the biggest influence, and in China, it was reported to be teachers at school. On the other hand, we asked students to indicate who had the least influence on their decision, and they could select up to 3. Here, we can see that social media influencers, friends, and news and media outlets seem to have the least amount of influence on the student decisions. I'll now hand it over to Sarah, who will cover the impact of policies in other destinations.
Thanks, Somo. I think Ellie might have mentioned this at the beginning, but if you'd like, if you have questions about the methodology, about some of the results, please feel free to use the chat and we will get to that at the end. So now we'll take a look at how policy changes in other destinations may be impacting student choices. Go to the next slide. As many of you may be aware, there have been a number of changes in both policy and rhetoric coming out of the other major English-speaking study destinations over the past 9 to 12 months, and they have had a major impact on international student demand. So before we dive into the survey results, we wanted to share a brief recap of the changes that have taken place. So in Australia, starting January 1st of next year, there will be a total cap of 270,000 new international students across Australia for the year. There have also been changes in the financial requirements. So their version of kind of a state mandated or federally mandated I-20 has increased to Australian 29,710. And they've also increased the student visa application fee by 125% as of this summer to 1,600 Australian dollars. In Canada, the available funds requirement has doubled to be over 20,000 Canadian dollars. As you may have heard, it's hard to miss. The Canadian government announced a cap earlier in the winter on international students, and they've further reduced that cap by 10% for 2025 and 2026. And this will also include master's and doctoral students. They've also made changes to postgraduate work eligibility program or permits. So as of October 1st, college graduates are no longer eligible for a postgraduate work permit unless their study is in an area of high labor demand. Lastly, rising visa costs, IHS costs, and salary thresholds make study and post-study stays less accessible in the UK. They've also had a few immigration policies specifically on the dependent visa end that make the UK appear less welcoming, but there is a new government in place and they are trying to kind of reverse that rhetoric and make statements in support of international students being very welcome. They've also committed to a graduate visa. So, what all of this is showing us, our data broadly shows us, is that the changes in both policy and rhetoric are having a significant impact on international student perception and demand for those destinations. And there may be an opportunity here for the US. Carolyn, we can go on to the next slide. So, on the survey results. So, we wanted to get a sense of if recent policy changes in Canada, Australia, and the UK have indeed influenced students to choose the US. And what we saw is that a quarter of students said yes. So, this is quite significant as these are potential students that the US may be enrolling in the next several years that would have otherwise considered other destinations as their first choice. Taking a look at that same question, but by source country, we can see which students were most affected by these policy changes. So Kenya had the highest percentage of students indicating the policies affected their decision, followed by India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and then China. We also wanted to know which destinations' policies were the ones impacting these students the most. So we can see here that Australia and the UK tied at 39%, followed closely by Canada at 37%, and then smaller percentages for Ireland, New Zealand, and Germany. All right, so we'll now dive into the main event and talk about a very light, non-polarizing subject, US politics. So we wanted to get a sense of how politically aware these international students are, specifically in regard to US politics. So we asked them, which of the following statements about political awareness best describes you? And as we can see here, about 44% of respondents said, I only know a little bit about US politics. This was next followed by 26% of students who said, I'm generally aware of US politics. Next, we had 18% of students saying, I don't follow US politics at all. And finally, 12% of respondents who report that they follow US politics closely. And looking at this political awareness breakdown by source country, we can see that Kenya has the highest number of respondents who follow US politics closely. Nepal has the largest cohort saying they are generally aware of US politics. And China has the highest proportion for both. I only know a little and I don't follow at all. So we then asked students, how much would the election outcome influence your decision to study in the US? It's a question I think on all of our minds. And perhaps somewhat comfortingly, and in contrast to, I think, the last time we polled students in the 2021 poll, the majority at 54% said not at all. They are resolute in their decision to study in the United States. This was then followed by slightly at 20%, moderately and unsure tied at 11%, and significantly at 4%. Now, looking at this again by source country, we can see that India has the highest percentage of students saying their decision will be significantly affected by the election, but it's still only at 8%. Nepal has the highest combined total for moderately and significantly. And then a large chunk of students from China say their decision may be slightly affected by the election. And at this time, I'll pass it to Ellie Butler, who will cover candidate preferences.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So yes, we'll now take a look at student perceptions of the candidates, as well as key issues and policies in the US. So of course, we wanted to ask which candidate students prefer. So of the students who said the election outcome would influence their decision to study in the US, 57% said they'd prefer to study in the US with Kamala Harris as president, and 43% for Donald Trump. Now, interestingly, as we saw in those first two slides, this is a bit of a shift from the results following the 2020 election, when there was a more defined split and a stronger preference for Biden. So we wanted to take a deeper look at this divide by study level, source country, and gender. So first, taking a look at candidate preference by study level. So breaking this question up by undergraduate and graduate students. We see, interestingly, that graduate students have a stronger preference for Kamala Harris. So that's over on the right-hand side of this slide. We can see a more defined split, with 63% of students in favor of Kamala Harris and 37% in favor of Donald Trump. For undergraduate students, then, on the left of this slide, it's a much closer race. So 54% in favor of Harris and 46% for Trump. Now, when we break candidate preference down by source country, we see some really interesting variances. So Kenya and Nigeria, over on the left of this slide, have the strongest preference for Kamala Harris, above and beyond all other source markets. So it's interesting to note that the African countries surveyed are so strongly in favor of Harris. This is then followed by Nepal at 63% for Harris, 37% for Trump, and then China and India, which are much closer. And in India, we actually see a dead even split in candidate preference, 50-50. So we'll now take a look at this same question, but by gender. So we do indeed see a gender split. 62% of females are in favor of Harris, as we can see on the left of this slide, while only 51% of males are. And while we don't have it pictured here on this slide, this difference is even starker in certain source countries that were surveyed, such as India and Pakistan. So next, we wanted to get a sense if there was any change in student interest to study in the US, thanks to the switch in candidate from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. So we asked if this switch had any effect on their decision to study in the US, and this question was only asked of that subset of students who said they'd prefer to study under a Kamala Harris presidency. And we can see that 34% of those students on the right said not at all, the change in candidate did not affect them. But notably, 50% of students did say some variation of yes, as you can see in the boxes here. So from this, we can infer that the change in candidate did have an impact. It potentially reinvigorated some folks and created a sense of positive momentum. Next, we wanted to get a sense of how students feel either candidate would affect their home country. Would they be good or bad for their home country overall? And the majority of students feel both candidates would have no effect on their home country. This is then followed by about a quarter of students who feel both Trump and Harris may affect their countries positively. But interestingly, we see differences when it comes to affecting their home countries negatively. So we see in the call-out boxes here that more than double the amount of students are saying Trump would affect their home country negatively than Harris. So we wanted to take a look at this question broken down by source country. And this is quite a busy and confusing slide, but I'll walk you through the most important takeaways. So we have Donald Trump across the top here and Kamala Harris across the bottom. So the first thing that I'll call your attention to is the difference in this negatively portion. So there are more students who believe Donald Trump will have a negative effect on their home country than Kamala Harris. In most cases, we actually see very small numbers for Kamala Harris affecting home countries negatively. So that's across the very bottom of the slide here, except in the case of China in our first column, where 23% of Chinese students feel Kamala Harris may have a negative effect on their country. The other item that I'll call your attention to on this slide is that India has the highest proportion of students who feel that Donald Trump will affect their home country positively. And this makes sense, as we saw India was the country that had the highest proportion of students in favor of Donald Trump. So now we'll take a look at key issues in the US. So we presented students with a list of top issues in general, as well as policies related to international students studying in the US. And we asked students which candidate would handle each of these issues better. Now, in many cases, students indicated neither candidate would handle them better. So that is across the bottom here in green. But if we disregard the neither, we can see some clear differences in student perceptions of the candidates and major issues. So in the call-out boxes here, we can see that Trump had the greater proportions of students who said that he would be better at handling the economic stability of the US, as well as the political stability of the nation. Across all other areas, Kamala Harris took the edge over Trump. And just in case you cannot see them all, I'll read them out here. So that includes welcoming people from other countries, the ease of obtaining a student visa, the management of social issues, future career prospects for students in the US, pathways to permanent residency, perceptions of the US overseas, post-study work visa policies, safety of citizens and visitors, and well-being of international students. So across a lot of those softer factors, we see Kamala Harris taking the edge. We next asked students about specific policies for supporting international students and how important those policies are to them. So we can see here on this slide that orange is very important, followed by blue for important, all the way down to yellow for not at all important. So over on the left, we can see that the most important issue for students, and perhaps this is no surprise, is that they'd like to see the expansion of government scholarships and financial aid. So they'd like more money. This was then followed by increasing transparency and efficiency for obtaining student visas. In third place, we see expanding opportunities for work during study beyond CPT. Next, we see expanding available options to work after OPT and before legal permanent residence. And lastly, we see clearer pathways to permanent residency. And finally, we wanted to get a sense of students' primary concerns about studying in the US. So we asked them if they are concerned about the following issues in the US and if they factored them in while deciding to study in the US. So we can see in order of items that students are extremely concerned about, we have gun violence coming in first place with 56% of students extremely concerned. This is followed by cost of living, racial injustice, they're in third place, healthcare in fourth, and then this is followed by not being welcome as an international student, and lastly, extremist groups and civil unrest. We also did have a free text entry for this section where students also indicated they were concerned about mental health support, about making friends and fitting in, and so on. But overall, we saw safety emerged as the most frequently mentioned concern. So putting all of this data together, we'll take a look at our key summary. So we saw that the US continues to be viewed very favorably due to our quality of education and the reputation of our institutions. Most students will not be influenced by the US election outcome, but some students did indicate that the outcome may affect their decision to study in the US, ranging from slightly to significantly. Students showed a slight preference for Kamala Harris overall, but variations were seen by study level, source country, and by gender. We saw that students would be most interested in expanded government funding for scholarships and increased transparency and efficiency in visa processing. And in terms of concerns, respondents were most concerned about gun violence, cost of living, healthcare, and racial injustice in terms of studying in the US. So at this time, we can open it up to any questions that folks may have about the survey results. And we've been asked about the countries that were represented in the survey, and a note that we did not see many Middle Eastern and Southeastern countries represented in the survey. This is a fantastic question. And the answer to that is that these were students who were already engaged with our counselors and had already engaged with IDP in the counseling process. So the students who responded to the survey just happened to be from within that pool of students who are already working with us. We did have student respondents from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, but not in great enough numbers to be represented as kind of those core source countries that we pulled out in the data. So we did want to make sure that we had a significant number of students to feature them within the survey data. Excellent question. Any other questions before we close here? And if not, we would always be happy to welcome your questions following the presentation. I see one more question just came in, and that is how many students were surveyed. We had 916 respondents. So this was a pulse survey, typically smaller in size than our emerging futures surveys, where we have about 6,000 to 10,000 students per survey. For our pulse surveys, we typically have about 800 to 1,000 students respond. And yes, slides will be shared with all attendees and all registrants following the session. Excellent. Well, with that, I think we will close. Don't see any further questions coming in. The gender profile of the students. Yes, so we did have a slide on gender. Not sure, Carolyn, if we can jump back to that. So respondents for this survey were about 52% male. Let's see, 52% male, 47% female, with much smaller percentages who said they preferred not to answer or they don't identify as male or female. So fairly even split in terms of gender, but then obviously some differences did emerge in terms of gender preferences for the candidates. The survey was administered in August and September. It was out in the field from August 27th to September 12th, 2024. Yes, thank you so much, Carolyn, for pulling this back up. So for the question about gender, this was our breakdown. So more females in favor of Kamala Harris than males. All right. Well, I think with that, we will close. So I want to thank you all so much again for joining us. This webinar was recorded, and the recording and the slides will be shared with you all in a follow-up email. So take care, and we'll see you next time. Thanks all.